I'm Brian Gibbons, and today we're here in our first video of a series of 4 videos to talk to you about how to give a good science presentation. So if you're like me, you've probably seen a fair number of presentations in your day. Some of them probably very good, other ones, maybe not so good. What I'd like you to think about for just a second is why exactly that is. What makes a good presentation good, or a poor presentation not so good? That is a question we're going to be addressing in this video series. In order to get the ball rolling a little bit, let's look here at this title slide. You can see that it has a lot going for it. It's a very clear image, not very much pixelation there. And we're talking about science presentations, and we have someone there doing some fun science in the background. We also have a nice title here up at the top, Preparing a Kick-Ass Science Presentation. Now, one thing that I've actually learned about giving a good presentation, and I've learned this fairly recently, is that generally profanity is frowned upon during a presentation, and this especially applies to the title. So perhaps if we were going to edit our title slightly, we might change it like so, and maybe call it Preparing a Good Science Presentation instead. Or if you're a fan of the Prairie Home Companion on NPR, we could call it Preparing a Pretty Good Science Presentation. Now, as I mentioned, this is the first in a series of 4 videos, and this first video is going to focus on things that you need to do to prepare your presentation before it actually starts. So this is all stuff you're going to do before you actually are in the presentation room. Now, you may not know it, but actually there's quite a bit of money wasted on bad PowerPoint presentations. So you may find this rather easy to believe, depending on the types of presentations you've seen thus far, but it totals out to about $250 million a day that is lost due to bad PowerPoint presentations. And when I say lost, I mean that presentations are primarily designed to communicate a message from the speaker to the audience, and if that message is not communicated, people's time is wasted. If those people are being paid money to be there, that money then is being wasted as well. So our goal today is to hopefully cut back at some of this money that's being lost for bad PowerPoint presentations. Which brings me to my next slide, which is what exactly makes a good presentation. And as you can see, very much like a recipe, a good presentation has a large number of different ingredients. And they all need to be there. And they all need to be in the proper proportions. If you add too much or too little of any given thing, the recipe ends up not so good. Or in our case, the presentation ends up not so good. You should also spend time thinking before you begin about what type of presentation you're going to make, as there are a number of different types of presentations that will all require some specifics that are specifically associated with them. For example, you may be giving presentations in your classroom, in lab meetings, you may be asked to present a poster, you may be doing student seminars, journal club presentations, or ultimately and hopefully presenting at a scientific meeting in front of a large number of people. Each of these represents a different presentation format, and you'll have to adjust your style accordingly depending upon what type of presentation you're going to give. The key thing here is to just recognize what the norms are for that particular presentation, ask if there's any rules or guidelines ahead of time, and please abide by those. Also, you should make sure that when you're going through your slides, you should transition smoothly between them. And if there are multiple presenters speaking, as is often the case in classroom presentations or in some more formal settings as well, you should make sure you have a plan for transitioning carefully and smoothly between the different speakers that are presenting. Whenever you're planning your presentation, one of the very first things you should consider is how much time do you have to talk? Is this a 10-minute presentation, or do you have to talk for an hour? Depending upon the presentation type, it's dramatically going to change how fast you have to get the information across and how much information you're able to convey. Now, it's very good to estimate that there's approximately about 2 minutes spent on every slide. This isn't always true. Certainly some slides you'll talk more, some slides will just be title or transition slides. We'll talk for a very brief period of time, but estimate about 2 minutes per slide. That means if you're giving a fairly long talk, let's say an hour-long talk, you have about 30 slides as a limit within that period of talk. You should also take some time and practice your talk beforehand. You shouldn't go in speaking it for the very first time ever. You should have practiced your talk ahead of time and also timed it so you know exactly how long it's going to take. When you are giving your presentation, this kind of relates back to the different types of presentations that are out there, you should think very carefully about who your audience is. Think about what it is that they know and what it is they don't know about the information that you're going to give them. You don't want to give them all kinds of information that they already know, but you also don't want to leave people in the dust if there are certain people in your audience that just are behind or don't really understand what you're talking about. So it's good generally to assume that your audience knows little background and to provide plenty of explanations wherever possible. You should also ask yourself, and this is especially the case for a persuasive speech, if your audience has any biases or misconceptions that might actually change their attitudes towards your presentation. You should always be able to anticipate your audience's response to various questions ahead of time, and that will definitely help in your presentation planning. When you are going through with the presentation, the key thing is to focus on a relatively few number of messages, and those are your key messages. Typically about 1 to 4 messages is recommended, although depending on who you ask, that might be slightly increased or decreased. Generally, just talking about a few things is good because people typically only remember a couple of things from every presentation. They'll remember so-and-so looked at such and such, and they found this and that. And that's basically all they're going to remember. So it's good to make sure that when they're walking out of the presentation room or the conference hall, that they know exactly what your key messages were, and they can take those away with them. Another big question that I'm often asked by students is, where do you start? What is it that you start doing in the beginning to prepare for your presentation? And it's always very smart to begin with the end in mind. That means that you should kind of have a sense for what it is you're trying to produce, how long it's going to be, what the general goals of that presentation are going to be before you even get started. Then you prepare a list of ideas that are different ways that you can achieve those goals or different pieces of information that you want to express. Write down everything you think will be relevant to your presentation and just prepare a list with no particular order. The next step then is to choose the proper arrangement of all the ideas and all the information that you want to convey. There are a number of different options for different ways you could convey this information. One of the more common ones for science is the evidence to conclusion order. We say we have this evidence, and generally it leads us to believe this as our conclusion. You can also do the opposite. You can do the conclusion to evidence order, where you say basically this is what I believe, and all this information over here is the reason why I believe that. Another very common one is a cause to effect order if the cause and effect are known, although you should be careful not to confuse the cause and effect if you're going to do that. And actually, probably one of the most common, one of the best ways is the final one, which is the order of importance. And typically the way you want to arrange this is to arrange them from least important to most important, and that way they will leave with a very big and good impression at the end of your presentation, thinking of what your key ideas are. A modified version of this is to start with your second most important point to kind of get their attention and get them thinking about the issue, and then move on down the list to your most important point at the end. With a thing that you're preparing, whether it be a report, a document of any kind, or a presentation, it's very good to organize it ahead of time, and I highly recommend doing this with the help of an outline. Now, an outline can be a very simple document consisting primarily of bullet points of the key things that you want to say, but you should go through the time to actually create one of these documents. It's fairly easy, fairly straightforward, and in the long run, it will save you time. Doesn't always seem like it when you're about to start making one, but it will save you time in the long run. Typically, most presentations will have these 3 core parts in their outline: an introduction, where you'll typically capture the audience's attention. You may tell a story, you may have a joke, you may say a surprising fact to them to capture their attention. They will have a body of the presentation, which includes all the key facts and information that you're going to provide. And finally, you'll have a conclusion where you sum things up, basically tell your audience what it is that you just told them, and give them those important takeaway messages for when they go home. Last but not least, one thing you have to absolutely be sure to do is to master the material before you present it. If you get up in front of a large audience and then suddenly realize you don't fully understand the experiment, or it's not 100% clear what's going on, your audience will know it. They can really easily tell whether or not you've taken the time to go through and learn what it is that you're telling them. And that will help your credibility a lot if you certainly come across as being very knowledgeable about your subject. If there's something that you don't know well about your particular subject, it's generally a good idea not to talk about that particular part. And whatever you do, don't make stuff up if you happen to get stuck and don't know. Finally here, when it comes to mastering the material for a presentation, it's very good to, when you are practicing, to practice out loud, because just the mere act of saying the words out loud will really help you be able to say them more clearly when it comes to finally presenting your presentation. Now we are at the take-home messages slide for this presentation, so hopefully you've gotten a few things out of it. These are really the 4 core messages that we have for this particular talk. One, you want to identify the particular type of presentation that you're going to give. This is usually a very, very easy step. Secondly, you want to identify what all your key messages are. And this can be a bit trickier. Oftentimes, students will really hone in on either too many messages, or they might just hone in on one that could be broken down into a few smaller sub-messages. So you should have key messages that will encompass what it is you're talking about, but also that are fairly specific and fairly clear what it is they're talking about. Like, for example, a key message shouldn't be, I'm going to talk about science. That would be far too general for a key message. You should organize your ideas, number 3, with an outline. Preparing an outline ahead of time is usually a very smart idea. And last, master all the material it is that you're going to present. So this concludes this first video in our series of 4 video presentations. I highly recommend you check out the others if this has been at all helpful to you. Thank you very much.